The phone rang in the middle of second period, and nobody in that classroom knew yet that the next 4 minutes would change how an entire school looked at one 15-year-old boy. Dr. Kovacs answered it the way she answered every call, half distracted, still facing the whiteboard, mid-sentence about protein synthesis. Then she stopped talking. She turned around slowly, the phone still pressed to her ear, and looked across the room at Marcus Delaney like she was checking he was actually real. Marcus, she said, there's someone on the phone for you. A pause that lasted just slightly too long. It's a researcher from NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. 11 students went silent at once. 2 rows back, a boy named Dominic Ashford, the one who, 6 weeks earlier, had laughed in Marcus's face and called his entire science project a jar of dirt, stopped writing mid-sentence and looked up. To understand why that phone call happened, you have to go back further than 6 weeks. You have to go back to a rainy morning, a boy carrying something wrapped in plastic bags, and a room full of people who had already decided, long before he opened his mouth, exactly how much he was worth. Even further back than that, you have to go back to a kitchen, a phone call from a school on a hill, and a woman who had spent her whole life being told what she and her family were not. Claudette Delaney had answered phones for bad news her whole life, about Marcus's mother not coming back, about the apartment fire on Lexington when Marcus was 6, about her own knees, twice, both times with news she didn't want. So when the phone rang on a Tuesday evening in April, the spring before Marcus started 9th grade, she answered it the way she answered every call, braced. Mrs. Delaney? This is Diane Forsyth, calling from the Office of Admissions at Hargrove Academy. Claudette sat down at the kitchen table. Marcus was in his room, doing homework, or what she assumed was homework. I'm calling because Marcus has been selected for our Horizon Scholarship Program. Full tuition, books, materials, and a stipend for extracurriculars. We were very impressed with his entrance exam scores, particularly science and math. 99th percentile. Claudette didn't say anything for a moment. Is everything all right? Miss Forsyth asked. Yes, Claudette said. Yes, everything's. She stopped, put her hand over her mouth, and closed her eyes. For a moment she wasn't in the kitchen anymore. She was somewhere further back. A different kitchen, a different city, 26 years old with a baby on her hip, and a stack of bills she couldn't pay, hearing a different voice tell her things weren't going to work out the way she'd hoped. They want him, Claudette said, mostly to herself. We do, Miss Forsyth said warmly. After they hung up, Claudette sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Then she went to Marcus's door and knocked, even though she never knocked, because some news needed a knock first. Baby, she said when he opened the door. They want you. He didn't understand at first, wanted him for what, which they, and she had to explain it twice. He sat down on his bed like his legs had stopped being reliable, and they both just sat there for a while, not saying much, because some things were too big to talk about right away. That night, Claudette made him his favorite dinner, smothered pork chops and rice, the kind that took 2 hours and that she usually saved for birthdays. While it cooked, she thought about her own mother, who'd cleaned houses for 30 years and used to say, "The rich don't let you in because they like you. They let you in because once in a while they need to feel generous, and you happen to be standing there." She'd carried that for 40 years, and now here was Marcus, about to walk through a door people like them almost never got to walk through. "You're going to go there," she told him over dinner, "and people are going to look at you funny sometimes. It's not because of anything you did, because of where you're from, and what you look like, and what kind of car picks you up. Which is no car, it's the 47 bus, and don't you ever be ashamed of that bus." She pointed her fork at him. "You hear me?" "Yes, Grandma. You're going to be better than all of them, at the thing that actually matters, which is the work. Not the talking, not the clothes, the work, you understand?" "Yes, Grandma." "Okay then, eat your dinner." He ate his dinner. And later, lying in bed, he thought about the word they want you, and wondered what it would feel like to walk into a room where, for the first time in his life, somebody had decided, in advance, that he belonged there. He would find out, starting in September, that wanting and belonging were not the same thing at all. The morning Marcus carried his science project into Hargrove Academy. It was raining, the gray flat, indifferent kind of rain that makes everything look tired before the day even starts, the kind that soaks through a hoodie in 2 minutes and turns cardboard to pulp. He'd wrapped the project the night before, sitting on the floor of the apartment while Claudette watched the evening news in the next room. 3 layers of plastic bags from the Save-A-Lot on 5th Street, rubber bands to hold them tight, electrical tape over every seam. Because the project couldn't get wet, because he'd worked on it for 7 months, and because it was, in a very real sense, all he had. He walked 6 blocks to the bus stop, holding the project with both arms, rain running down the back of his neck. He was 15, wearing the same dark blue hoodie he wore most days, and the gray and white sneakers that had been fresh about 3 years before he got them. His backpack, too heavy with textbooks, rode his shoulders while his arms carried the thing that mattered. He stood at the bus stop for 11 minutes, thinking about the data the whole time. By the time he reached Hargrove, gates, circular driveway, Range Rovers, a black Tesla with tinted windows belonging to Dominic Ashford's father. The rain had eased, but Marcus was already soaked through. He walked into the gymnasium and found the back corner near the emergency exit. Scholarship corner, some kids called it, not always kindly. He unwrapped the plastic carefully, peeling back each layer like something that might still be breathing. He arranged his data sheets, plugged in his flickering laptop. He noticed Dominic Ashford looking at him from across the gym, the way you'd look at something that had wandered into the wrong room. He went back to straightening his charts. The other projects had arrived the way everything at Hargrove arrived, expensively. Dominic's quantum computing project came in a custom black display case with LED strip lighting along the interior edges, carried in from the Tesla by his father's assistant. Camille Beaumont's CRISPR project on aging in model organisms was printed at a professional shop, complete with a QR code linking to a digital portfolio. And her mother, a biomedical researcher at City University, had already told 4 parents in the parking lot that it was mostly Camille's work, in the tone of someone who didn't expect to be believed and didn't especially care. Jade Weston's hydraulics project had her civil engineer father's fingerprints all over it, and nobody said anything, because everyone's parent had helped with something. Marcus's display board was the smallest in the room. His folder held 43 pages of soil analysis data and a bibliography of 21 peer-reviewed papers. A methodology section Dr. Avex would later call more rigorous than some graduate-level work she'd reviewed. It started before the judges even arrived. The setup period was 90 minutes, and Hargrove students filled unstructured time with a social architecture. Marcus had never quite learned to read. Groups forming and reforming, conversations floating at different volumes, the smell of coffee from the teacher's table, mixing with rubber and industrial cleaner. Marcus was double-checking his methodology summary when he heard footsteps stop near his table. He looked up. Dominic Ashford was standing there with 2 others, Preston Clark, whose family owned a construction company, and Bria Holloway, who wasn't unkind exactly, but had a talent for laughing at precisely the moment that made things worse. Dominic held a cup of coffee that had definitely come from the teacher's table, and he looked at Marcus's board with an expression somewhere between amusement and genuine confusion. "Is that hand-drawn?" Dominic said. Some of the charts were the ones Marcus had made before he figured out how to use the graphing software on the library's public computers. He'd kept them because they were accurate, and because the contrast between his hand-drawn early work and his later computer-generated analysis actually told part of the story. "Here is where I started. Here is how far I came." "Parts of it," Marcus said. Dominic tilted his head. "What's it about?" "Soil microbiome analysis." A pause. "Dirt?" "Microbial communities in urban soil. Specifically the correlation between neighborhood income levels and rates of beneficial bacterial species decline." Preston Clark made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. You did your science project about dirt. From poor neighborhoods. Rich neighborhoods, too, Marcus said. Control group. Bria Holloway looked at the board. She wasn't smiling exactly, but something was happening at the corners of her mouth. Your display is kind of small. The data isn't. Dominic leaned in, reading the title. Then he straightened up and looked at Marcus the way people look at things they don't know how to categorize. Not cruelty exactly, but a dismissiveness that was, in some ways, worse. It's a good effort, he said, for what it is. A pause.
You're on scholarship, right?
He said it in a tone that was technically neutral. The kind of tone with plausible deniability, built right in. Yeah, Marcus said. That's cool, Dominic said, in a voice that meant the opposite, and they moved on. Marcus straightened his charts again. His hands were steady. He'd learned to keep them steady. He had no idea that within 6 weeks, Dominic Ashford would be sitting 2 rows behind him when a phone call rearranged everything. Right now, all Marcus knew was that he had 90 more minutes before the judges arrived, and a board that some people had already decided wasn't worth a second look. To understand why Marcus had spent 7 months on a jar of dirt, you have to understand the empty lot on Garfield Street. It had been there as long as Marcus could remember. A rectangle of cracked, gray-brown ground between a boarded-up laundromat and a row of houses with plywood where windows used to be. Nothing grew there except weeds with roots like steel cable, and even those looked like they were struggling, like the ground itself had given up on the idea of supporting anything. When Marcus was younger, he used to walk past it on the way to his old school, and he never thought about it much. It was just there, the way a lot of things in the neighborhood were just there, the way you stop noticing the smell of a place you live in. Then, the winter before 9th grade, he read an article in a science magazine he'd borrowed from the library. A magazine that was technically 2 years out of date, but Marcus didn't mind because the science in it wasn't out of date, just the news. The article was about soil microbiomes, the trillions of bacteria, fungi, and other organisms that live in healthy soil, that break down organic matter, fix nitrogen, form networks with plant roots, and essentially make growth possible in the first place. He read it 4 times. And somewhere in the 4th read, he thought about the lot on Garfield Street, and a question formed in his head that he couldn't quite shake. What if the problem with that soil wasn't the soil itself, but what used to live inside it, and doesn't anymore? He went to the library the next day and started looking for research on urban soil microbiomes. He found plenty. Studies on agricultural land, studies on industrial contamination sites, broad regional surveys. But almost nothing at the scale he was thinking about. The scale of a single neighborhood, a single empty lot, a single city block, compared to another city block 3 miles away, where things still grew just fine. Nobody had mapped that. So, sitting on the floor of the apartment with library books stacked around him, 15 years old, Marcus decided he would. He started with 12 locations. He picked them carefully, some from neighborhoods like his own, some from neighborhoods on the north side where the lawns were green and the trees were old, and nobody had ever had to wonder whether the ground beneath them was alive. He bought sterilized glass jars from a dollar store and cleaned each one 3 times. He bought a labeling gun with money he'd saved from helping Mr. Okafor, the man who ran the corner store, carry deliveries on Saturday mornings. He took the bus, sometimes 2 buses, to each site, and at each one he photographed the location, recorded GPS coordinates using an old phone with a cracked screen, noted the surface conditions, and tried to find whatever historical information he could about what used to be there. A factory, a rail yard, a row of houses that had been torn down in the 70s and never rebuilt. He collected his first sample on a Saturday in January, kneeling on the edge of the Garfield Street lot with a trowel and a jar, while an old man across the street watched from his porch and eventually called over, "What you doing, son?" "Electing a soil sample. School project." The old man considered this. "This dirt's been dead for 30 years, he said, pointing at the boarded-up laundromat. "Used to be a dry cleaner's right there." Chemicals got into the ground. My mother used to say you could smell it for years after. Did anybody ever test it after it shut down? The old man laughed, not unkindly. Test it? Son, nobody around here gets things tested. Things just get left. That's how it goes. Marcus thought about that the whole ride home. Things just get left. And somewhere, on the 47 bus, with the jar of Garfield Street soil in his backpack, he understood his project wasn't really about bacteria. Not only. It was about the difference between a neighborhood where someone tests the ground and a neighborhood where nobody ever does. And what happens to the people living on top of the ground that nobody tested? Extracting DNA from soil samples requires equipment Marcus didn't have: centrifuges, certain reagents, lab-grade glassware. He spent weeks reading papers looking for a method that could be adapted, and found a 2019 paper describing an extraction protocol written by a team with equipment Marcus could only dream about. He read it more times than he could count, listing every piece of equipment it called for, and, next to each one, what he might use instead. A centrifuge became a refrigeration cycle technique he invented himself. Repeated cooling and gentle agitation, exploiting the fact that different particles settled at different rates at different temperatures, if you tracked it carefully enough. It took 3 failed attempts and most of February to get consistent results. He documented every failure, what he tried, why it didn't work, what he changed. Reagents came from a chemical supply store across town, ordered in the smallest quantities available, safety data sheets read twice, before he touched anything. He did some extraction in Hargrove's biology lab after hours. Miss Reyes, the lab assistant, let him stay late on Thursdays, never asking too many questions, just unlocking the door and saying, "Lock up when you're done, and don't touch the centrifuge. That one's mine." The rest he did at home, on the kitchen table, with his grandmother's old refrigerator doing double duty as lab equipment. Something Claudette found endlessly amusing, though she never once complained about the jars living on the bottom shelf for months. He ran the analysis on a second-hand laptop, $40 from a pawn shop, screen flickering in the corner if tilted too far. He built his own database, a spreadsheet that grew to hundreds of rows. 7 months, every weekend, most evenings, library days, park days, bus and walk days across the city for one more sample from a site marked on Google Maps. Claudette watched him work and never once told him it was too much. She brought him tea some nights, stood in the doorway watching, then went back to the television without a word. He was 71, with bad knees, and worked 3 mornings a week at a church resale shop. And Marcus knew she understood something about work, even if she didn't understand the science. The project's title ended up longer than some classmates' entire presentations: Urban Soil Microbiome Decline in Low-Income Neighborhoods, a comparative DNA analysis of microbial community loss and proposals for targeted bioremediation. He made a display board. He printed charts at the library, 50 cents a page, until he'd spent the $8 he'd saved. He mounted everything with rulers and tape. He wrapped it in plastic the night before the fair, because it was going to rain. The judges arrived at 10 o'clock. Dr. Patterson from City University's chemistry department, Dr. Simona Barra, a visiting researcher from Johns Hopkins, and Robert Yee, a Hargrove alum now in biomedical technology. Dr. Kovacs and the principal, Mr. Halstead, accompanied them. Halstead shaking hands with everyone at least once. They started on the other side of the gymnasium. Marcus watched, without appearing to watch. He'd been doing that since September, studying this world without making it obvious. He saw Dr. Ibarra spend nearly 10 minutes at Dominic's display. Robert Yee photographed Camille's foam board, heard murmurs of approval. He looked back at his own table. Hand-drawn charts, library printer graphs, 43 pages in a manila folder. He believed in the data. He had to keep believing in it. The judges reached his corner at 10:47 a.m. He knew because he'd been checking. Dr. Patterson looked at the title, then at Marcus, then back at the title. Urban Soil Microbiome. Interesting angle. He picked up the methodology summary and read it standing up. Most judges flipped through things. Patterson actually read. How many sample sites? Dr. Ibarra asked. 12 primary sites, with 3 repeat samplings across 4 months, to control for seasonal variation. Her eyebrows moved, just slightly. You controlled for seasonal variation? Yes. Certain bacterial strains fluctuate with soil temperature, so I wanted to separate climate effects from contamination effects. Where did you do the DNA extraction? Dr. Patterson asked. Partly at school, in the biolab after hours, Ms. Deus let me use the equipment. Partly at home, adapting a protocol from a 2019 paper. He named the journal without hesitating, using materials from a chemical supply store. You adapted a professional extraction protocol with home materials. Yes. Documented all the substitutions in the appendix. He found the page in 4 seconds and handed it across the table. Dr. Ibarra and Dr. Patterson both looked at the same page. The room was the same room, same fluorescent lights, same faded badminton lines. Something had shifted in the small weather system of Marcus Delaney's corner of it. Robert Yee set down the chart. How old are you? 15. Yee looked at the other 2 judges. A very quiet look, but Marcus saw it. Dr. Kovacs, standing slightly to the side, looked at the display board like she was seeing it for the first time. A recalibration, quick and almost invisible. He'll make sure to review everything thoroughly, Dr. Patterson said. They moved to the next table. Marcus straightened his charts. He didn't know it yet, but that was the moment the day stopped going the way everyone had assumed it would. A lunch was served in the east atrium, where natural light came through a slanted glass ceiling, and someone watered the potted plants every Tuesday. Marcus sat with his tray at the end of a long table with 2 other scholarship students. Priya, doing a project on water filtration, and Jonah, who barely spoke but seemed to notice absolutely everything. Across the atrium, Dominic was at the center of a group of 6, laughing at something. The sound carried easily. Marcus didn't look directly. He ate his sandwich. How'd it go with the judges? Priya asked quietly. Okay, I think. Dr. Ibarra spent like 3 minutes at my table, she said. What about you? More than that. She looked at him. More than 3 minutes? Yeah. She was quiet for a moment. That's a good sign. She picked at her lunch, then said, almost to herself, you ever feel like there's 2 different fairs happening? Like there's the fair where the judges look at the work. And then there's the other fair, the one that's already been decided. And the judges are just confirming it? Marcus thought about Dominic's coffee cup, the custom of display case. That's cool, said in a voice that meant the opposite. Yeah, he said. I've felt that. And then sometimes something happens that doesn't fit either fair, Priya said. And everybody has to figure out what to do with it. She smiled a little. Anyway, good luck this afternoon. Marcus finished his sandwich. He thought about the way Dr. Patterson had read the methodology, standing up, not skimming, not flipping. He thought about Dr. Ibarra's eyebrows moving when he mentioned seasonal controls. He thought about Robert Yee's quiet look at the other 2 judges. He let himself feel it for exactly 30 seconds. Then he packed it away. He'd learned the hard way that hope, held too loosely, became something you could trip on. The afternoon session was presentations, 10 minutes each, judges in a row, the rest of the students as audience, Dr. Kovacs running a timer. Hargrove students were, as a rule, accomplished presenters, coached since they were 12 to stand straight, speak clearly, project confidence. Dominic went third, polished in the way expensive coaching produces, smooth transitions, rehearsed pauses, a slight smile at moments meant to feel impressive. His project was genuinely good. Technically, it was also obviously scaffolded. You could see the edges where a consultant had organized the structure, where his real understanding thinned into borrowed language. Yet confidence covered a lot in rooms like this one. The audience applauded warmly. Parents nodded approvingly. Marcus went 15th, near the end. He walked to the front carrying his laptop and a printed slide deck. He'd practiced 12 times in front of the bathroom mirror. His grandmother had sat in the kitchen doorway twice, nodding occasionally, understanding maybe 1 word in 5, but listening with the attention of someone who knows what effort sounds like. He plugged in the laptop and looked out at the room. Judges in their row, parents along the wall, students half paying attention or on phones. He saw Dominic in the second row, one arm along the back of the chair beside him, already deciding this wasn't worth his full attention. His Marcus thought about the empty lot on Garfield Street, the soil that looked like concrete, the things that used to live in it. He started talking, not about soil as an abstract topic, but as a living system, a community with a history. He explained how beneficial bacteria fix nitrogen, break down organic matter, form networks with plant roots, create the conditions that make growth possible. He explained how those communities get destroyed. Compaction, contamination, chemical runoff, decades of policy decisions that concentrated industrial activity near residential areas with no political voice. He showed the comparative maps, 12 sites, color-coded by microbial diversity, overlaid on a map of median household income by census tract. He walked through the correlation, the seasonal controls, the extraction methodology, and its limitations, naming those limitations himself, clearly, without being prompted, something Dr. Patterson would mention later. He talked about intervention, not speculation, but a proposal grounded in existing bioremediation literature. Targeted reinoculation of depleted microbial communities, specific strains matched to specific site conditions, low-cost methods that could work at community scale. He pulled a small demonstration model from under the table. 2 jars, same soil type, same seedling, one with depleted microbial community, one reinoculated, grown 6 weeks under identical conditions. The difference was visible without a microscope. He held up both jars. "This is what healthy soil looks like," he said. "And this is what happens when the life inside it is gone." A pause. "We have a lot of soil that looks like the one on the left. We know what it would take to change that. The science exists. What's been missing is someone looking at the specific neighborhoods where the problem is worst and building the dataset to address it." He looked at the judges. "That's what this project is. 10 minutes and 4 seconds. The gymnasium was quiet for a moment before the applause started, not the warm, automatic kind that followed Dominic, but something else, slightly surprised, the sound a room makes when caught off guard. Dr. Kovacs wasn't clapping. She was writing something in her notebook, fast, like she was trying to capture it before it disappeared. Thies walked back to his chair. Jonah, 2 seats down, gave a very slow, very small nod. The judges deliberated for 90 minutes. The gymnasium transformed into a reception of sorts, parents and students milling around, refreshments near the entrance, the ambient social performance of people who knew each other and knew their own value, and were comfortable in that knowledge. His Marcus stood near his display and answered questions from 2 parents who came over with what seemed like genuine curiosity. He explained the methodology twice. One of the parents, a woman who introduced herself as Dr. Obi, asked specifically about the extraction protocol, adaptations, and where he'd sourced the materials. She had the careful, interested manner of someone who understood the science. He also overheard, from a cluster of students near the refreshments table, Dominic telling a story that ended with the punchline. He literally brought in a jar of dirt, a jar of dirt. Laughter followed. He turned back to his display. He looked at the 43 pages in the manila folder. The data is right, he thought. The data is right. Whatever happens next, the data is right. When the judges came back, Dr. Kovacs called everyone to attention at the front of the gymnasium. The room settled into anticipatory quiet. Parents shifted, students straightened. Dr. Patterson spoke first, summarizing the judging criteria: scientific rigor, originality, methodology, analysis, presentation. He said the level of work had been impressive across the board, which was what judges always said. And then he said 3 projects had distinguished themselves in ways the panel wanted to specifically recognize, the part everyone was actually waiting for. 3rd place, Priya Mehta, water filtration. Priya made a quiet, surprised sound and covered her mouth with both hands. She walked to the front, received a certificate and a handshake from Mr. Halstead, and was crying a little by the time she got back to her seat, in the good way. 2nd place, Camille Beaumont, CRISPR Aging Research. Camille received this with the composed grace of someone who had been expecting it, which she probably had. She thanked the judges, thanked her parents, mentioned her mother in a way that was either sincere or strategic or both.
First place.
Dr. Patterson paused. In the pause, Dominic straightened slightly, almost imperceptibly, in the automatic posture of a person accustomed to receiving recognition. First place, and the project that will represent Hargrove Academy at the Regional Young Scientists Competition. Marcus Delaney, for Urban Soils Microbiome Decline in Low-Income Neighborhoods. A comparative DNA analysis of microbial community loss and proposals for targeted bioremediation. The gymnasium made a sound that wasn't quite normal applause. It was fuller than that, more complicated. Some of it was genuine. Students who had paid attention during his presentation and understood something had happened. Some of it was the automatic response of polite people, and some of it, from the parents along the wall, particularly Dr. Aby, who started clapping before anyone else, was something closer to recognition. Marcus walked to the front. His hands were steady. He shook hands with Dr. Patterson, with Dr. Ibarra, with Robert Yee. He shook hands with Mr. Halstead, who looked, for just a second, like he was seeing Marcus clearly for the first time. He received the certificate and held it at his side. He walked back to his corner of the gymnasium. He looked at his display board, the hand-drawn charts, the library printer graphs, the 2 jars of soil. He thought about his grandmother. He thought about her hand over her mouth, standing in the kitchen. The data was right, he thought. He had 6 weeks left before the day that would change everything. He didn't know that yet either. The 6 weeks between the science fair and the phone call were, in most ways, ordinary. Marcus's win earned him a slot at the Regional Young Scientists Competition in early December. He spent the time refining his methodology, adding 2 more sample sites, 14 total now, and writing a more detailed bioremediation proposal, the part he cared about most, because it was the part that actually did something for the neighborhoods he'd studied, instead of just describing what was wrong with them. At school, something had shifted, but not dramatically. Most students still didn't know his name. A few, Priya, Jonah, a handful of others, started saying hello in the hallway. Dr. Kovacs stopped by his locker sometimes, asking how regionals prep was going, in a way that felt different from a polite check-in. Dominic mostly ignored him. The jar of dirt story made the rounds and then faded, the way these things did at Hargrove, where the social weather changed fast and nothing held a grudge longer than it took to find something newer. Marcus had other things on his mind anyway. 14 sites, a proposal needing 3 more revisions, and a grandmother whose knees had been bothering her more. Which meant Marcus did more of the grocery runs, taking the bus to the Save-A-Lot on Saturday mornings with a list in his pocket and exact change counted out in advance. For now, the 6 weeks passed the way weeks pass, until it was a Tuesday in early December, mid-morning, second period, and the classroom phone rang. It wasn't unusual for the classroom phone to ring. Administrative messages, schedule changes, the rare parent call forwarded from the front office. Dr. Kovacs answered without breaking her train of thought, holding the receiver to her ear while continuing to face the whiteboard. And then she stopped. She turned around slowly, in the way people turn around when the information coming through the phone is reorganizing something fundamental about the moment they're standing in. She looked at the phone, then at the room, then at Marcus, then back at the phone. "Yes," she said carefully. Yes, he's right here." A pause, of course. 1 moment. She held the phone slightly away from her ear and looked at Marcus with an expression he had never seen on her face before. The expression of someone who's just been told that something they suspected was real has been confirmed to be real. And the confirmation is large enough to require a second to absorb. "It's Marcus," she said. The room was already quiet because of the way she'd said yes. He's right here. 11 students who'd been half paying attention were now fully paying attention. "Marcus," Dr. Kovacs said again. "There's someone on the phone for you." She paused. "It's a researcher from NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. The silence in the room was the particular silence of 11 people having the same thought at the same time, and all of them realizing they were having the same thought. Dominic Ashford was in this class. He was sitting 2 rows back and 3 seats to Marcus's left, and when Dr. Kovacs said the words NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, he stopped in the middle of whatever he was writing and looked up with an expression that would take Marcus years to fully describe. Not anger, exactly, not embarrassment. Something more complicated than either. The expression of a person whose understanding of the world's order has just been interrupted by a fact that doesn't fit, and who doesn't yet know what to do with that fact. Marcus walked to the front of the room. Dr. Kovacs handed him the receiver with both hands. The way you hand someone something fragile. He took it. "This is Marcus Delaney." The voice on the other end was a woman's, professional, slightly warm. She introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Chen, a senior researcher in the Astrobiology and Planetary Science Division. She explained that she'd come across a summary of his project through the Regional Competition Committee. A colleague had flagged it, she said, as something worth paying attention to. He asked if he had a few minutes to talk about his research. "Yes," Marcus said. "Good. I want to ask you about your extraction methodology. Specifically, the adaptations you made when working without a centrifuge. I read your appendix, and you described a low-speed separation technique using refrigeration cycles. You want to understand your thinking there, because we've been dealing with a related problem in a very different context." Marcus looked at the wall in front of him. Behind him, he could feel the particular quality of 11 people's silence, the kind that exists when no one wants to make a sound because they're afraid of missing something. He started explaining. He explained clearly and carefully, the way he always explained things, using specific language, because specific language was respectful of the person you were talking to. He talked about the temperature differential and why it allowed partial separation without mechanical force. He talked about the contamination risks he'd controlled for. He talked about the 3 iterations he'd gone through before he found the approach that gave him consistent results. Dr. Chen listened. She asked follow-up questions, real ones, the kind that can only come from someone who understands the material and wants to understand it better. At one point she said, "This is exactly the kind of lateral thinking we need." At another point she said, "Have you considered how this might apply to extraterrestrial soil analogs? We're working with material that has some similarities to your contamination scenarios. Chemically sparse environments where you're trying to detect organic signatures without the benefit of a full laboratory setup." Marcus said, "I've thought about planetary soil chemistry, but I hadn't specifically considered the extraction angle." A pause. "That's interesting. The key variable in my adaptation was minimizing thermal disruption to the organic compounds. If you're dealing with chemically sparse material, that same principle might apply. You'd want to preserve whatever organic signature exists rather than degrading it in the extraction process." A pause on the line. Then Dr. Chen said carefully, "How old did you say you were?" "I didn't," Marcus said. 15. Another pause. And Dr. Chen spoke again. There was something different in her voice. Not less professional, but more deliberate. The voice of someone choosing their next words with attention. "Marcus, I'd like to send you some documentation about a project we're working on. Preliminary stage. I can't share details on a school phone line." A brief pause. "Would it be all right if I called you directly? Do you have a contact number I could use?" Marcus gave her his grandmother's cell number. He turned around. 11 students were looking at him. Dr. Kovacs was looking at him. His Dominic Ashford was looking at him. His pen was still in his hand. The notebook was still open. Whatever he had been writing was still unfinished. Marcus walked back to his seat. He sat down. Dr. Kovacs stood at the front of the room for a moment, and then said, in a voice that was doing its best to return to normal, "Where were we?" Nobody answered. She looked at her notes. "Protein synthesis," she said. "Transfer RNA." She turned to the whiteboard. Class lasted 32 more minutes. Nobody took any notes. The ride home was the crosstown bus, and then the 47 running south, and Marcus sat in the back with his backpack on his lap, looking out the window at the city, going by corner stores, apartment buildings. The barber shop with the red and white pole that had been there since before his grandmother moved to the neighborhood in 1987. He was trying to be careful about what he let himself feel. He'd learned that the hard way, the year before Hargrove, when he won a district essay competition, and expected it to change something about how the other kids at his old school saw him, and it hadn't. He'd learned it in the first month at Hargrove, when he thought doing well in class would be the thing that mattered. Before he understood that doing well in class was just the minimum. This was different. He could feel that it was different, and he was trying not to let himself feel how different. Because if it turned out to be smaller than it felt, he'd have to carry that disappointment too. He thought about Dr. Chen's voice when she found out he was 15. He thought about lateral thinking. He thought about exactly the kind we need. He put his head back against the seat and allowed himself for exactly 60 seconds to feel the full weight of the possibility that the thing he had made, with library time and borrowed equipment and soil from 14 locations and 43 pages and everything he had, might actually be big enough to reach people at NASA. Then he packed it away, not because he was giving up on it, but because he needed to take it home and give it to his grandmother, piece by piece, so she could feel it too. Slowly, the way she absorbed things that mattered, sitting in the kitchen with the evening news quiet and the tea going cold. He owed her that, the good news too. He got home at 4:17. His grandmother was at the kitchen table, doing the crossword from yesterday's newspaper. The one she always did, because yesterday's was easier. Reading glasses on, pencil in hand, a cup of chamomile tea that had been going for a while. "Hey baby," she said. He sat down across from her. She looked up from the crossword. She'd been looking at him for 15 years and knew the difference between all his silences. The tired ones, the thinking ones, the wounded ones, the ones that meant he didn't want to talk yet. She looked at him now and set the pencil down. "What happened?" she said. He told her slowly, the way it had actually happened, starting with thank Doctor. Avax picking up the phone, moving through the silence in the classroom, getting to the voice on the other end, and what it said. He told her about lateral thinking, and about exactly the kind we need, and about being asked to give his phone number, so they could call back. Claudette listened without speaking. When he finished, she sat still for a moment. Then she reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, her hand smaller than his now, that had gotten smaller in the last few years the way old hands do, but still had the same quality of touch she'd had since he was 4 years old, when she'd taken him in after his mother left and his father was already gone. He didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, "You've been working on that project since February." "January, actually," he said. He started reading about it in January. She nodded. "I know," she said. "I noticed." The room was quiet. Outside, a car went by. The refrigerator hummed. The evening news would start in 40 minutes. "NASA," she said. "NASA," he said. She nodded slowly, with the particular gravity of someone who'd been waiting, without knowing exactly what they were waiting for, to hear a word that meant something was going to change. "Okay," she said. That was all. But the way she said it, "okay," was a whole sentence. It was, "I believe you." He always believed you. I am not surprised, not because this is small, but because I knew you were capable of something this large. It was everything she hadn't said out loud in the kitchen doorway, all those nights she'd stood watching him work, and then gone back to the television. He turned his hand over under hers and held it. Dr. Sarah Chen called back the following Saturday on Claudette's cell phone at 10 a.m. The call lasted 1 hour and 40 minutes. JPL, she explained carefully. Researchers are careful when talking about something unannounced, was in early stages of a project related to detecting biological signatures in degraded soil analogs. The problem wasn't detection itself. The problem was detection in conditions where you couldn't assume a standard lab setup, where samples were chemically complex, and where the extraction process itself might destroy the organic signatures you were looking for. He's Marcus's refrigeration cycle adaptation, built in his grandmother's apartment from 3 published papers and a chemical supply order, had solved, in principle, a version of the exact problem her team hadn't cracked. Not the whole solution, but a bridge nobody on her team had built. She asked about every decision he'd made, every substitution, every failed iteration, what he'd do differently with real lab equipment. He answered all of it. "Spoken with my division director," she finally said. "We'd like to invite you to JPL's summer research program. You've never offered a spot to a high school student before." A pause. "We'd like to offer one to you." Marcus could hear his grandmother in the kitchen. A cabinet opening, the click of the stove. He thought about the empty lot on Garfield Street. About 50 cents a page. About a jar of dirt. "Yes," he said. "I'd like that." The school found out in pieces, the way things always find out at schools, through channels that had nothing to do with official announcements and everything to do with the way information moves, between people standing near each other. Dr. Kovacs knew first, because Marcus told her on Monday morning. She listened standing in the doorway of her classroom, coffee cup in both hands, and when he finished, she said, "I owe you an apology. He should have looked more carefully at your project from the beginning. I should have seen it sooner." A pause. "I made assumptions I shouldn't have. I'm sorry for that." "You saw it when it mattered," Marcus said. "That's what counts." She nodded, but didn't look entirely satisfied by that. Which meant she was taking it seriously, which was what he'd hoped for. By Wednesday, Priya knew, and grabbed his arm with both hands, and said, Marcus loud enough that 2 tables turned to look, and then immediately stopped apologizing for being loud. Because, as she put it, no, actually, this deserves being loud about. By Friday, everyone knew. Mr. Halstead announced it at assembly, carefully, formally, saying Marcus Delaney had been invited to JPL's summer research program, that this was an extraordinary achievement, and that Hargrove was proud. Marcus sat in his row and kept his face neutral. Some students looked genuinely pleased, some looked surprised in a way that said they hadn't fully resolved their earlier evaluation of him. He beamed 2 rows back. Jonah gave him the same slow nod as before, and Dominic Ashford was clapping. Not leadingly, not enthusiastically. It genuinely, the mechanical clap of someone who decided to do the right thing even though it cost him something. Marcus didn't look at him long. There was nothing to win there. There was one more thing that happened, and it happened quietly, which was the way the most important things usually happened. 2 days after the assembly, Marcus was in the school library during a free period working on his proposal for regionals, when Dr. Aby, the woman who had come to his display at the science fair and asked about the extraction protocol, appeared at the table. He looked up. She sat down across from him. He recognized her, but they had only briefly met at the fair. She introduced herself properly now. Dr. Adeze Obi, adjunct professor at City University, Environmental Microbiology. She had a daughter at Hargrove, in 9th grade. He'd come to the fair as a parent, but she'd stayed at his table as a scientist. "I've been thinking about your project since October," she said. He reached out to the regional committee to make sure they understood what they were looking at. "I also sent a note to a colleague at JPL about your extraction methodology." She paused. "I believe that note is part of how they found you." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "That was you," he said. "The research deserved to be seen by people who could see it properly," she said. "You did the work. I just made sure the right people were looking." He thought about January. He thought about 50 cents a page. He thought about a jar of dirt. "Thank you," he said. She shook her head slightly. "Don't thank me for that. Thank me by doing something with it." She stood up. "Come find me when you get back from Pasadena. You want to hear what they taught you." She left. Marcus sat alone at the library table. Outside the window, the city spread in every direction. Apartment buildings, corner stores, empty lots, the barber shop with the red and white pole, the bus routes he knew by number, the soil he had sampled, where people lived and where things were slowly dying, and where the science said there was a way to bring them back. He opened his proposal document. He started writing. The regional young scientist competition took place at City University on a cold Saturday in early December, 2 weeks before the JPL call, though of course Marcus didn't know that yet. He had 14 sites now instead of 12, a revised bioremediation proposal, and a manila folder grown to 51 pages. The auditorium was bigger and louder than Hargrove's gymnasium. A boy at the next table, presenting a water-efficient irrigation from a public school across town, introduced himself as Tyrell and asked what Marcus's project was about. And Marcus told him. Tyrell's eyes lit up. "Wait, you're the dirt guy?" Somebody said a kid from a private school did a whole project on soil in poor neighborhoods, and it was apparently insane. He figured it was some surface-level PR thing. He looked at the stack of papers on the table. "You did all this yourself? From a private school? On scholarship," Marcus said. Tyrell nodded slowly, like something clicked into place. "That's different then." He held out his hand. "Good luck, man, for real." It was a small moment, but it stayed with Marcus, being recognized not as the scholarship kid or the dirt guy, but as someone who'd done the work by someone who'd also done the work. The final round put the top 5 finalists in front of a live panel. Marcus made it. A soil scientist named Dr. Castillo asked why his methodology so thoroughly documented its own limitations. Most researchers minimized that. "Because the limitations are real," Marcus said. "If I don't talk about them, someone else finds them later. And then they might think the whole project is unreliable instead of just one part of it." Castillo nodded slowly. "That's a more mature answer than I expected." A man representing an industry partner asked what the first practical step would actually look like if a city took the data seriously, not the science, the logistics. Marcus answered without hesitating, because he'd thought about it for months, lying awake imagining what it would take to actually do something about the lot on Garfield Street. You wouldn't need heavy equipment on day one. Cheap soil testing kits to confirm the baseline at the highest priority sites. In the re-inoculation material, based on my demonstration model, that doesn't require specialized equipment either, just the right microbial cultures and a distribution method. You could train local residents to do it. The hardest part isn't the science. He paused. It's somebody deciding it's worth doing in the first place. Marcus came in second. Camille's CRISPR project took first and would go to nationals, but the panel created, on the spot, an award for applied impact for Marcus's proposal. A small plaque, a modest grant, and an invitation to present to the city's Department of Environmental Services in the spring. Afterward, Camille found him in the lobby. "I heard what people said about your project at Hargrove, the jar of dirt thing." He didn't say anything, and I should have. She looked uncomfortable. "I'm sorry." "Thanks for saying it now," Marcus said. "Better late than never," she said, and smiled, a little awkwardly, before she left. Marcus stood there a moment, holding his plaque, thinking about how some apologies came right away, like Dr. Avax's, and some came 2 weeks late in a university lobby, from someone who hadn't needed to say anything at all. Both kinds counted, just differently. His grandmother came to the airport the morning Marcus left for Pasadena in June. She wore her good church coat even though it was already warm, because this was a good coat occasion, and she stood at the terminal entrance and held his face in both her hands, the way she had done since he was small. Not roughly, not weepingly, but with the solid, factual tenderness of someone who has loved someone for a long time and is not afraid to show it. "You call me," she said. "Every day," he said. "You eat properly." "Yes, Grandma. You don't let anybody make you feel like you don't belong there." She looked at him steadily. "Because you belong there. You built the thing that got you there. Nobody gave that to you." He looked at her, 71 years old, bad knees. The church resale shop on Tuesday mornings. The crossword from yesterday's paper. "Cup of tea." "I know," he said. She let go of his face. She smoothed the front of his jacket once. "Go on then," she said. He went. He walked through the terminal with his backpack on his shoulders and his boarding pass in his hand, and the project documentation in a folder he had packed on top of everything else so he could access it easily. He passed the security line, and the gate, and the rows of seats, and the windows looking out at the tarmac. He found his seat on the plane. He put the backpack in the overhead bin. He sat down. Through the window, the city was visible one last time. This angle, from the terminal approach, showed the downtown towers and the stretch of neighborhoods beyond them. All of it from a height that made the streets look like a grid. The buildings like small shapes, the empty lots and the occupied ones, and the places where things grew and the places where they didn't, all of it compressed to a pattern. From up here, you could almost see the whole thing at once. He thought about the soil maps he'd made. 14 sites now, color-coded, overlaid on the city grid. He thought about how the pattern had been there in the data before he'd made the maps, had been there in the actual Earth before the data, had been there for decades in the places people lived. And all it needed was someone who would look at it long enough and carefully enough, and believe that the data had something to say. The plane began to move. Marcus leaned back in his seat and looked at the ceiling and let himself feel it fully this time. Not just for 60 seconds, not packed away before it could become something he'd have to carry. All of it, the bus stops, the library, the soil jars, the rainy morning, the plastic bags, the fluorescent gymnasium lights. A long silence before the applause, the phone ringing during second period, the voice that said, exactly the kind we need. He felt it until the plane left the ground. And then he opened his folder and started reading about astrobiology. Because there was work to do. There was always work to do. There are names that rooms learn slowly. There are names that have to earn their way into the space that other names occupy easily, by inheritance, by money, by the quiet confidence of having never been told to doubt yourself. His Marcus Delaney's name took longer to learn, but it got there, and when it arrived, it stayed. The kind of name a room doesn't forget, because it came attached to something the room had not known to expect. The thing was the work. It was always the work.